let's take a look at the Midwest, and there's 3 states that deserve mention. And the first one is Illinois, which has a rich railroad history. A lot of railroads, private railroads, once upon a time had Chicago in the name because a lot of railroads emanate from Chicago. This is just, I thought, a cool picture of a very space age or modern looking train for back in the day, maybe back in the 50s when this came out, maybe in the 40s. And this shows that same train pulling into a station in western Illinois back in the day. So this map shows that there's a lot of stations, and Illinois subsidizes their trains more than any other state when it comes to dollars per train. They're tied with New York for the most train routes that are aided by state subsidy, and they give $34 million a year to Amtrak, and so they're second behind California. They're well behind California, but still, for the amount of riders and the amount of trains, the cost is higher per train. So they have less trains, but they cost more per train, partly because the ridership is lower, but Illinois is stuck with it. A lot of these train lines in Illinois have been in existence for a while, so they try to provide good coverage of the state, and this shows the different lines. They have an Illinois Zephyr train, as well as the California Zephyr that goes all the way to the Bay Area. So this shows that there's a lot of lines in Illinois, but there's also major cities that the trains don't go to, surprisingly, given the number of train lines. So it doesn't go to Rockford, which is one of the bigger cities. It doesn't go to DeKalb, Illinois, where Northern Illinois University is, big commuter school to the Chicago area. It doesn't go to Moline and the Quad Cities area. It doesn't go to Peoria, which you would think it would. And then some of the bigger towns downstate like Jacksonville, Decatur, and Edwardsville. And at least in Edwardsville, it stops in Alton, which is near Edwardsville, but it doesn't go to a lot of the bigger towns. So they used to back in the day, and I'll show some stations that are still standing in case they do want to reinstitute train service. I wanted to mention a couple of other towns that the trains used to stop at on their way to some of the other towns that I highlighted, like Dixon, Illinois, Ronald Reagan's birthplace, where he grew up. If a train came out of Chicago, went to DeKalb, it could go through Dixon on the way to Moline. Or the trains used to come out of Chicago on the Rock Island line and went down through Marseilles and Ottawa on the way to Peoria and through LaSalle, Peru. And I can recall being on an Amtrak train as recently as the 80s that went through Streator. So there's all kinds of possibilities. I swear every town in Illinois the train used to go to at some point. So there's a lot of old train stations that are still sitting there and could be put back into use. And it's an argument I will bring up again when I'm talking about Michigan, or pretty much any state, is that there's a tendency for people, because of the high prices of housing in the major metropolitan areas like Chicago and its suburbs, for people to want to look where they could buy a house for less, which would be further out into the country, but still decent-sized towns, and say they have a work arrangement where they only have to go into the office in Chicago 2 or maybe 3 times a week. Well, then having a longer commute isn't such a bad thing, and it would help bring back a lot of these farm towns to life, and I think it would be a real boost, and I think it's going to happen. It's just a question of how much each of the states is going to do to help that happen. And Illinois, which I never mentioned the number, but they spend on the order of $6,600 per train subsidizing trains. So they're already doing more than any other state. But Illinois also has a lot of problems and needs to do things to encourage economic development and revitalization. So having ways to get into the major city where there are jobs, but still live out in the state and help bring back to life a lot of rural communities. It'd be a win-win for everybody. So anyway, that's just my overall comment, but I'll be making that comment again, especially talking about Michigan, also as it relates to doing the long commute into Chicago. So let's take a look at some of the stations in Illinois. There are many, and I'll show them on each line. So let's start off with Chicago Union Station. It's actually owned by Amtrak, They don't own too many stations across the country, but they own some of the bigger ones. Philadelphia 30th Street Station and Union Station in Chicago. And it's a beautiful station designed by Daniel Burnham, and that's the interior. It's one of my top 10 stations that I highlight in a separate video on the best looking train stations in the US. So this definitely makes the list. So I'll go out on the various lines. So this is a station where Amtrak stops, but it's mostly a commuter station in Glenview. And then similarly, this is a town of LaGrange, their station, which is mostly, again, a commuter rail station for Metra, which is the suburban commuter rail system in the Chicago area. So this is going west out of Chicago. And Naperville is on the same line as LaGrange. And then Plano is further out west. And I think there have been talk about Metra going all the way out to Plano, but I don't know that they have yet, but Amtrak stops here. So here's one of your more rural communities where people could commute in on Amtrak and go to the city a couple times a week. Further out, Mendota. Further west is Princeton, Kewanee. And Galesburg is on the same line, the Burlington line, and the high school basketball team, the high school sports teams are called the Silver Streaks, named after that same train that I showed at the start of the Illinois portion of this video. And I included Burlington, Iowa, because it's right on the Mississippi. It's right across the river. I will actually be mentioning this station again in another video coming up, but I wanted to mention it here. I think it's a really interesting station, and it's the station that the whole Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad gets its name from, the start of its name, and it's in the Prairie Moderne style, which is unusual. And not a lot of stations were built in the 1940s because of the war going on, everything, but this was designed by Halliburton and Root from Chicago, who designed some other major, they're still in business, they designed major things like the Nicollet Hotel in Minneapolis and Soldier Field in Chicago, just to name a few. And then similarly, let's start at a line that goes into Iowa. Briefly, this is right on the Mississippi River to Fort Madison, Iowa. Let's go back east now. And the first stop back in Illinois is Macomb, Illinois, which is the home of Western Illinois University. And then Quincy is right on the Mississippi River, kind of on a spur line. Now, this is all the way back in the Chicago area Summit. It's just a shelter, not much to look at. And Joliet, which is a good-sized town outside of the Chicago area. It's half its own city, half a suburb of Chicago. And now we're going down south again. This is Dwight, new station. I showed the older station on the left. I don't know if it still exists, but they've built a new station, as they have done at Pontiac. And I believe these are built by Illinois DOT for Amtrak. Bloomington Normal, which is the home of Illinois State University and also State Farm Insurance. Lincoln, Illinois. And then Springfield, the state capital. So this is another state where the train does go to the state capital, which is good to have. Further south, Carlinville. This is owned by Amtrak, fairly new station. And then Alton, which I had mentioned previously, way down in the St. Louis area. Okay, going back to Chicago and going on another line south. This is the most eastern line going north-south. So the first stop would be Homewood, where Amtrak stops. Then Kankakee, and they have a really nice home designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in Kankakee that I walked around a couple of years ago. So I had a positive view of Kankakee. Gilman, which is way out in the country where basketball players come from small high schools. Rantoul, which used to have an Air Force base. This is north of Champaign. The next stop, Champaign-Urbana, the home of the University of Illinois, my alma mater. So there's a train called the Illini, and then I don't know how it works, but on the same line, there's the Saluki, which goes further south. This is Mattoon, Illinois, which is near Charleston, Illinois, which is the home of Eastern Illinois University. So the state universities, except for Northern Illinois University, are all served by Amtrak, which is a good thing. And then south of that is Effingham, then Centralia, And I have to say, I was hoping that some of these Southern Illinois stations would be old and quaint and something, but they're not. They're the opposite. They're really not much to look, especially this one in DuQuoin. It's like a Pizza Hut or a Dollar General store design. Wish they could do better with the Southern Illinois stations. And this is also the case in Carbondale, which is the home of Southern Illinois University. So speaking of architecture, I wanted to look up whether some of the great architects from Chicago ever designed any train stations. You don't see their names associated with train stations too much. In another video, I talked about H.H. Richardson. He designed a station in New London, Connecticut. Well, Frank Lloyd Wright did design a station, suburban station for Glencoe, but it was demolished in the 1950s, which is before he passed away. So I don't know if he cared too much. It wasn't that big a deal, but still, there was a Frank Lloyd Wright designed station. If it was today, I'm sure they would never demolish a station or anything designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. And then Louis Sullivan, who employed Frank Lloyd Wright early in his career, and Louis Sullivan was a great architect in his own right. They worked on a station for New Orleans. It looks like a prairie-style station, which is their style, but it's been since demolished. Yeah, so that's Illinois. And then this is the station, old station, no longer being used in DeKalb, which is the home of Northern Illinois University, which could be used. And then there's various stations that are just still here, still waiting, still hanging on. Possibly LaSalle, Peru, Ottawa, Marseilles, all on the same line, along with Peoria. Rockford, I don't know if that station still exists, but that's the only picture I could find of a historic train station in Rockford. And then Decatur has a really nice looking station. It's just dying to be reused as a station. Jacksonville, nice station. Edwardsville, as I mentioned. Rock Island, there used to be the Rock Island Railroad, so that's a very nice looking station if the train would return to service there. And then I also included little old Cairo. I guess that was all they had for a station way back in the day. It looks like the picture says it was from 1977. Those cars look like they're from the 1950s, but Cairo, I've watched different videos of how down on its luck that is, way at the southern tip of Illinois, which is so far south, it's much further south than much of the state of Kentucky, just to give you an idea. But the train still goes through Cairo, but it doesn't stop there anymore. So that's Illinois. Let's go on to the next state, Missouri. And I put Missouri on the list because of the Missouri River Runner train that they are now subsidizing. But I'll get into that a little bit more as we talk about Missouri. The River Runner train, it takes 5 hours and 40 minutes to go across the state. It connects the two biggest cities in the state, St. Louis and Kansas City. It has a pretty high on-time performance, 77.5%, and shows the map of Missouri and other states in the Midwest. But that's what you want to do. You want to have a line crosses the state and connects many major cities. So as you can see, actually there are three lines that cut through Missouri. Two are long-distance trains coming out of Chicago, one heading for Los Angeles, the other one heading for Texas, cutting through southeastern Missouri. Stops in Poplar Bluff. Texas Eagle and the Southwest Chief are the long-distance trains I mentioned. And so you'll see some of the trains that are in Illinois come right up to the Missouri border. The Lincoln service goes to Alton, and the Illinois Zephyr goes as far as Quincy, which is right on the Mississippi, right across from Missouri. So people from Missouri can go to those trains if they want. So I just think it's a really good thing that Missouri is subsidizing the River Runner train. I'll talk a little bit about it. So the one thing I've read about it recently is that there were 2 trains a day in each direction, but Amtrak has reduced it to 1 train a day because they weren't getting the payments that were promised by Missouri to support the River Runner. So that's unfortunate, but the states, they want to see ridership to keep supporting it, but sometimes it's a long-term thing rather than institute train service and people immediately start flocking to it or whatever. But it serves cities right in the middle of the state, so we'll look at some of the stations along that line as well as the other lines. And I just wanted to mention that there are other towns that the train doesn't go to One of them is Springfield in southwestern Missouri, and also it doesn't go to St. Joe, Missouri, right up the Missouri River, Kansas City. So freight service goes up along the Missouri, but no passenger service to St. Joe. And I put way down at the southern end of the state, I put a box around Branson, Missouri, just because a lot of people go there, but the train doesn't go there. It doesn't go anywhere near there. So there are definitely possibilities of other places it could go to. I put another couple boxes around major towns of the Ozark region, Osage Beach. And then the train doesn't go to Columbia, which is the home of the University of Missouri, but it does go to the state capital of Jefferson City. So that's good. So we'll start off St. Louis, and this is the modern station now that is used. And this is the former station that was used that is just fantastic. It's just Romanesque beauty. It's on the National Register. Fortunately, it still exists, but this is what it looked like when it was an operating train station. And it's a hotel now, but it's next to the station that is used now. But this is a fantastic station in St. Louis. So let's go west, Kirkwood, Washington, Missouri, Herman, and then Jefferson City. This is the station for a state capital, and I don't know the whole story here. I don't know if it's still the case, but the picture on the left is an old brick building, looks like colonial style. I think that was the station, but it was structurally unsound, so they moved into a trailer. But for the state capital, hopefully the situation will improve. But I don't know if this is the current situation, but it's what I saw when I was doing research. And then Sedalia, heading towards Kansas City, Warrensburg. Nice looking limestone station. That's a very popular building material in Missouri, a lot of limestone. Lee's Summit. Independence. Now we're getting close to Kansas City. And then this is Kansas City Union Station. Beautiful station. It's in my top 3 of all train stations in the U.S. It's not heavily used. It used to be much busier back in the day, but still a beautiful building. You can go there. You used to, a couple years ago at least, you used to be able to go to like a diner type restaurant, but just a beautiful station to walk around. Kansas City should be so proud to have this station. All right, and then that's it for the main east-west line in Missouri. And then these are stations on the other 2 lines, La Plata, Arcadia Valley, which was opened recently, attractive. These are on the line that go to LA from Chicago. And Poplar Bluff is the station on the other line that cuts through southeastern Missouri on its way to Texas. And the trains only stop here in each direction in the middle of the night. So if you come here during the day, you probably won't see a passenger train unless it's really running late. So that's Missouri. And it might not seem like a lot, but compared to some of the other Midwestern states, which I'll talk about in a future video, they're doing a good job, and I hope they keep it up. The other state in the Midwest that I think deserves a lot of credit is Michigan, because they are subsidizing all of the lines that run in Michigan. And without it, I don't know if they'd have any train service. So props to the state of Michigan. So here are the lines, and they really feed off being able to go to Chicago. If you look at this map, they only go east-west mostly to Chicago. It's kind of weird that a state like Michigan is not connected to the state right below it, Ohio, by train. There's no train lines that run to Ohio. I'll get into Ohio in a future video. They do go to Chicago. So it's another case where you can get to Chicago from fairly close to the southwestern corner of Michigan and commute. You could commute every day from a place like St. Joe's or New Buffalo or Niles. And then you would be further out, but it's still doable to commute in from Dowagiac. I hope I'm pronouncing that fairly closely, or Bangor, or Kalamazoo, or even Holland, or Grand Rapids. I mean, the whole state can really connect to Chicago, which I think is a plus for Michigan, as opposed to going into Detroit or Flint. With those cities not being anywhere near what they used to be, Michigan is helped by at least having a fairly strong city within reach that you can take the train to. So I think that's a selling point. It's also a selling point for the universities in Michigan, either in Ann Arbor or East Lansing. I'll talk about that a little bit as we go along. So you can see here from this map, I mean, these train lines are only in southern Michigan. There's no train service up to the upper part of Michigan. So start off at way on the southwest corner is New Buffalo, Michigan, which I mentioned, which looks like a suburban style station. And if you lived right close, you could walk over to the train and take it into Chicago. Very doable. Go through northern Indiana, which is much preferable to do so by train than driving, because the highways are really filled with trucks and it's not a pleasant ride around the southern tip of Lake Michigan in northern Indiana. And then going further out, St. Joe's, which the train station is half train station, half pizza restaurant. Bangor, Holland. We're going up the coast of Lake Michigan on the eastern shore. So just like the name Holland might imply, they have a large flower industry in this area. And then Grand Rapids is the end of this line. And Grand Rapids has a lot going for it. Big medical center. Okay, so on the other line, going more towards Detroit, this is Niles, Michigan, right on the Indiana border. And it's just a powerhouse of a station. I included it as an honorable mention in my best looking train stations in the U.S. Really impressed with the station at Niles. And then here's their next town that's hard to pronounce. I won't even try to say it. I'll let you say it. Kalamazoo. You don't even need to say what state that's in. There's only one Kalamazoo in the U.S. So Battle Creek, where all of our cereal is made. And this is the station that's used now. This is the former Michigan Central Depot, which looks beautiful, and I believe it's still standing. I haven't read anywhere that it was demolished. I think it might be being used as a restaurant, I think what I read, but beautiful. It'd be nice if this could be used. I don't know if the tracks still go by it, but beautiful. Albion, Jackson. When I first looked at this picture, I almost pictured Jackson, Mississippi. It looks kind of like a place in the South, but this is Jackson, Michigan. And then be prepared for the next picture of the most used station in Michigan, Ann Arbor. And Ann Arbor got one of these new stations that they were coming out with that generic Dollar General style of design in the 80s or the 70s. I'm not sure when this was built, but this is the station they use in Arbor. And just to make you feel wistful, this is what the station used to be that they had in Ann Arbor. It's now a restaurant, but another beautiful station. I think it's designed by the same architect that designed the Niles, Michigan station, another Romanesque powerhouse. Beautiful station, 1886. And then Dearborn. And then Detroit. Now this is all Detroit has now for a train station. Kind of small for a major city. This is what it looks like on the inside. Nothing to write home about. Pretty bare bones. And this is a far cry from the old Detroit Central Station. What a station. The building still stands. And for years and years, it was just all the windows were broken. It's just totally gutted, vandalized, you name it. And more recently, it's being fixed up by Ford Motors to be used, I believe, as a research center. So good for Ford for bringing this station back to life. And I think I read that the tracks still go behind it. So who knows? Maybe someday part of it will be used as a train station again. One can only hope. You hope for the best for Detroit. So from Detroit, there's a little line. It's almost like a commuter line, and it's on the Amtrak system, but you think of it more of as a commuter line. It doesn't. You have to go through Detroit to go anywhere else, but it goes northwest out of Detroit, Royal Oak, and then Troy. Very impressive modern transit center, and then Pontiac. So these are the stations so far that we've looked at. We have one other line to look at, but I wanted to bit more about the possibility of taking a train from, say, East Lansing into Chicago. If you caught a train, it would only take 2 hours and 45 minutes, which, believe it or not, it's considered a long commute in the New York area, but it's not out of the question. So let's say, you're a student and you want to go to the city. Here's how you could do it. You could catch a 9 o'clock train, get into this Chicago at 11:45, and spend some time there, get your city on, and then catch a 4 o'clock train back, or maybe stay overnight one night and then come back the next day. And price is pretty reasonable, $30 or $42. And you can see the business class was sold out on the dates that I looked at. And this just shows you again the proximity of much of southern Michigan to Chicago. So not out of the question, definitely within range. So the first station on this branch line, I'm going to call the Michigan State line, and I'll show all the stations in the same color scheme as Michigan State's colors, is the East Lansing station, which is owned by Michigan State University. So I've seen a couple of cases of that nationwide where a university owns a station or co-owns a station. The other case I'm thinking of is the University of New Hampshire owns or co-owns a station. I'll get to that in a later video, but it's pretty progressive of a university. It really reinforces the notion that you can use this station to go into the city if you want to. And as I mentioned before, when you're on this branch, it does not go to Detroit. So you're pretty much going to either be heading to Lake Huron and doing whatever you want to there, or you're going the other way towards Kalamazoo and Niles and then to Chicago. So that's what this station is set up to do. And I thought this is a really interesting station in Durand. People are sitting outside like a outdoor patio, very attractive. And it's one town away from Flint. And Flint, the best picture I could get was kind of a grainy, blurry picture. This is it, but it's another one of those carbon copy designs that were built back in the day. It didn't do Flint any favors. I mean, Flint probably had or still has a nice old train station somewhere, but this is what they have now. And the town of Lapeer. And then this is the final station on this line, Port Huron, which is right on Lake Huron. And it made me think that it's possible to maybe have some kind of service. You never hear about the possibility of taking a train from, say, Chicago to Toronto. And there is no passenger train line that goes all the way. I do see, like, when I look at via the Canadian rail system, it does go to the town across the way from Port Huron, and I believe there's a rail tunnel to Ontario. But I'm thinking, if you wanted to really encourage people and not scare them away by saying the train goes through Detroit, if you went north of Detroit and over to Port Huron and then somehow went over to Toronto, I think it would be a good seller. I mean, Chicago and Toronto think of themselves as kind of sister cities. They both have the Second City comedy troupe that they share, other things that are similar, but you never hear about taking the train between the two. I just think maybe that could be a possibility in the future. So that's it for the Midwestern states. And in the next video, since I tend to go on and on, it'll be on the main states on the East Coast, starting with Pennsylvania and New York, and then going up and down the coast. So again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.